Welcome to the Climate Diplomacy Podcast, a podcast from Adelphi, bringing you the latest insights and debates in international climate diplomacy. We are your hosts, Raquel Monayed and Hannah Kuonut. In this series, you will hear from leading experts offering their take on what needs to be done to promote climate foreign policy and provide you with the context you need to understand climate diplomacy today. For more information, please visit climate-diplomacy.org or follow us on Twitter under Climate Diplo.
So before starting with the usual introduction of our guest, I have a special announcement to make. Most of you don't know it yet, but I will be leaving Adelphi in July to join the diplomatic training at the German Federal Foreign Office. And I'm both so very sad to leave this incredible team and interesting workplace. And of course, also excited to start a new job and hopefully continue to work on climate security only from a different perspective.
And I'm still a little bit in denial about this.
So some weeks ago, Raquel asked me if there is any topic I would like to center our last joint episode on. And some of you might already know me good enough to know that this was rather an easy decision to make. So this is why in this episode, we will speak about climate justice, feminist foreign policy, and women, peace and security, and how these topics are interlinked. We are joined by Sheena Anderson, project manager at the Berlin-based Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. Sheena used to be a Mercator Fellow and is an activist with the Berlin-based Black Earth Collective and defines herself as a Black feminist and intersectional environmentalist. Welcome, Sheena. It's a great pleasure having you as our guest today.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you both for having me and the kind invitation. Yeah, I'm so happy to be here and to be talking about some of my favorite topics today.
Amazing. And when we look at these topics that we aim to discuss today, one could say that we really picked up the big and complex challenges of our time. But just before we jump in and start to dismantle them, could you give our listeners a short impression of what the CFFP does?
With pleasure. So the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, or CFFP as we say, is a research, consulting, and advocacy organization based in Berlin. And we work on topics such as anti-racism, climate justice, countering anti-gender movements, demilitarization and disarmament, and women, peace, and security. We are the world's first research and advocacy organization promoting an intersectionally feminist and people-centered approach to foreign policy. And in our understanding, feminist foreign policy seeks to rebalance power inequalities that perpetuate systemic violence. It does so by providing a political framework which is informed by the everyday experiences and needs of people who are affected by the policy decisions, specifically those most marginalized and excluded. And we believe that foreign policy, or specifically feminist foreign policy, has the potential to be a mechanism for equity, justice, solidarity, and peace. But as we always say, there can't be peace without intersectional feminism.
Great. Now that we're familiar with the concept of feminist foreign policy, we'd like to know what this has to do with climate justice. And at the beginning of this year, we've convened an event of the Climate Security in 3D series on climate justice for the most vulnerable. Mary Robinson, former president of Ireland, said at the time that the 5 layers of climate change injustice include racial injustice, gender injustice, intergenerational injustice, economic injustice, and injustice to nature. What is climate justice from your point of view, and how is it important for feminist foreign policy?
First of all, let me say that Mary Robinson is such a trailblazer when it comes to discussing climate justice within foreign policy spaces. And she really opened doors for a lot of people. And we actually had the pleasure of working with her during an event last year. And I agree with Mary Robinson on what she said on the 5 layers of climate change injustice, but would add health injustice and social injustice. For me, climate justice is an inherently intersectional concept that entails racial, social, gender, health, environmental, and economic injustice. So one does not go without the other. It frames how the grassroots energy of the environmental justice movement intersects with the global catastrophe that is climate change. Climate justice acknowledges that the base for political activism lies not in moral conviction or good intentions, but in socioeconomic consciousness, one of the great takeaways from the civil rights movement, actually. So summarized, climate justice means caring about the people and the planet. And that's exactly why it is, or it should be, important for any feminist foreign policy. As I said earlier, feminist foreign policy is informed by the everyday experiences and needs of people. But people suffer from the climate crisis already, and there is a relation between climate and conflict, and the crisis itself works as a threat multiplier. So, definitely should be on the agenda of any feminist foreign policy. Plus, the climate crisis is also a security issue, not only in terms of impact and conflict and being discussed by armies and military personnel, something we see increasingly happening, but in terms of threatening people in their everyday life. People already die or have to flee due to the climate crisis. People lose their way of life and everything they have. So, acknowledging that this is an essential foreign policy topic is the way to go, I think. And lastly, the climate crisis is a feminist issue as it specifically targets women, mostly Black, Indigenous, and women of color.
Thanks so much. I actually loved how you put it, caring about the people and the planet. It could be a really nice slogan, I feel. And as we've already learned in many of our previous episodes, people that contributed the least to climate change are the most vulnerable and affected with limited capabilities to respond, adapt, and mitigate. You've also alluded to it in your previous response, and they are also highly vulnerable to conflict risks, compounding climate injustices they already face. So, climate change affects people around the world differently depending on their livelihood, the country they live in, social and economic situation, age, gender, race, and other factors. Could you maybe explain why and how this is important and what this should mean for foreign and climate policy?
Absolutely. The unequal distribution of the climate crisis or of climate crisis impacts is actually shocking, and we see it all over the world. The COVID-19 pandemic has been an eye opener in this regard as well. For example, in the US, we see mainly Black people living in areas that are prone to natural disasters, but also in areas with bad water quality and a high level of air and environmental pollution. This leads to health issues for many affected Black people, but also Indigenous people and communities of color in general. Yet, we know that due to racism and structural inequality, it's exactly these communities that often work in underpaid jobs and thus cannot afford health insurance. And the pandemic has led to a higher rate of deaths in these communities exactly because they are at risk due to climate related health issues. And there are similar cases in the UK, for example, or in certain areas in Uganda, but also other countries where droughts force many people, mainly women, to walk long distances in order to collect water. These longer distances bear higher risks for sexual and gender based violence, mainly committed by men. Or if we take the 2004 tsunami in the Indian Ocean, where 70% of the casualties were women. Why? Because they often can't swim or move fast enough due to their clothing, or because they take care of other family members. Or, last example here, if we take Germany, during the horrific flood last summer, 12 people with disabilities drowned in their home because they could not flee or be taken to safety in time. So we see that the climate crisis is very much connected to topics such as sexual and gender based violence, domestic violence, gender roles, but also to racism and structural inequality, to classism, and to disabled rights and needs. What does that mean for a foreign policy? That we not only need gender responsive, but truly intersectional approaches if we really want to achieve climate justice.
Thanks so much for highlighting this with so many really interesting examples. And unfortunately, after a small reality check, we can see that we still have a different picture today. So, what do we see at the moment regarding climate justice and foreign security and climate policies?
First of all, I'd say we see that mainly global north countries do not keep their promises when it comes to climate finance, especially in terms of concretely supporting global south countries in climate adaptation and mitigation. Very often, this support is framed as development aid, but rarely are global north countries taking true responsibility for the climate related damage they have caused over the years. Sweden, for example, has just cut its contribution to the Green Climate Fund by 46% and its contribution to the Climate Investment Fund entirely. That's just one example. In general, there's such a huge power imbalance when it comes to this issue between global north and south countries perpetuating colonial structures. And with regards to framing the climate crisis as a security issue, which it definitely is, Countries tend to use this to further militarize the discourse on climate change. We equip armies with knowledge and technology to be better prepared for climate-related changes, but what about the people? We see an incredible militarization of the climate crisis, but not a lot of effort when it comes to truly protecting people and their livelihood, or climate activists for that matter. For example, in 2021, 227 environmental defenders were killed, more than a quarter of them indigenous people. That's also a security issue, but it is barely addressed on the global level. I am glad that there's a lot more openness and willingness to talk about the topic on a global level, but unfortunately, it is not done in a way that it leads to climate justice, and that's frustrating.
If you listeners could see Raquel and me at the moment, we are sitting in that Zoom call with Sheena and it's like nodding every second. Um, and I think we haven't nodded that much
Yeah.
in any other episode.
We're just here aggressively agreeing with you.
Yeah. So one important element of climate justice is the climate security nexus, meaning the connection between conflict, impacts of climate change, and security. Most listeners already know that this is what a huge part of our work at the Delphi focuses on. And I wrote an essay last summer about how the women, peace, and security agenda and climate security agenda would be stronger together and why it makes sense to advance both topics jointly. What is your take on this, even though, if maybe briefly, when looking at a rather abstract UN level?
I have a very short answer for this one, which is women protect the climate and intersectional climate policy protects women. So we definitely have to think about these topics together on all levels, actually. As the UN, and probably most listeners would agree, is a rather complex construct. I currently barely see any efforts to truly take this approach up, though. So there's barely any true effort to discuss these topics jointly, or they are discussed jointly, but then it doesn't go further. So we don't see policies, we don't see any action that truly takes the climate security nexus up. And then, even if it does, which barely happens, it almost never takes up a gender perspective. So, a long way to go, in my personal opinion.
Yeah, and as we already discussed, so the emergence of conflict and violence, it is often rooted in the existence of injustices, of course, pre-existing, so to say. Conflict and climate change, they compound these stressors and vulnerabilities that are linked to inequality. And this underpins the need to drive more climate finance, as we were talking before, towards addressing inequity in fragile states. So, would you agree? And shouldn't this also mean that we not only need a feminist foreign policy, but also a feminist climate policy?
I would most definitely agree. And for me, these two are interlinked anyway, feminist foreign policy and feminist climate policy. The climate crisis is an essential issue for human security, and a climate foreign policy must limit the climate crisis. It must foster climate justice, and it must support people in adapting to changing circumstances, especially women and other historically marginalized groups. Climate policy, or feminist climate policy, must make clear that this is not about individual choices, such as committing to a sustainable lifestyle, which is good, but it's not all that. It is more about overcoming oppressive structures that exploit not only people, but also this planet. And for that, we must find and offer intersectional feminist solutions.
So, Sheena, until now, we've rather stayed at the more conceptual and also the multilateral level. But when we look at climate justice, feminist foreign policy, and women, peace, and security, topics like gender equality, intersectional environmentalism, racism, sexism, and also colonialism, as you already mentioned before, they come to mind. Do you define yourself as a Black feminist? What does this mean when it comes to climate justice and climate security? And also to dismantle the complexities and multidimensionalities that we're looking at a bit further, could you give us a few practical examples of how intersectional environmentalism, racism, sexism, and colonialism are interlinked with climate change, with climate security, and of course, with climate justice?
Two very big questions. Regarding the first one, so to me, this means constantly asking, where are Black people here? Did we think of that? Are they represented? But not only Black people, intersectional perspectives in general. I don't know what life is like for a person in a wheelchair. I don't know what life is like for a person over 80 or for a non-binary person, but I do have the aspiration to always have them in mind, whatever I do. So asking myself, who is not sitting at the table? Who does not have a say in this or that? And I always tend to Black feminist theory and to the impressive struggles and achievements that many Black feminists before me have provided for me and for many others to learn from. And in terms of climate justice and climate security, I think it is important to strive for a decolonial approach here. We won't get anywhere if we do not decolonize our way of thinking and our way of acting. The climate bubble, so to speak, is not free from racist and colonial assumptions. So we have to constantly work on dismantling them. The climate crisis is so connected and actually not inseparable from racism, sexism, and colonialism. And until this day, we see that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are, on the one hand, being excluded from the climate discourse, even within the climate movement, facing racism and other forms of oppression. At the same time, Black, Indigenous, and people of color activists have been leading the fight for climate justice for decades. Yet this brings a high risk of insecurity with it. People face racism, people face police brutality, exclusion, etc. And then when we look at migration, we see people who have to leave their home, people who have to flee, a number that will only increase within the next years. However, there's still no legal framework on climate migration protecting these people. And then they face militarized and racist borders and border staff treating them unjustly. And we know that these people are mostly non-white. There are many more examples, but I do think whatever the issue is, intersectional environmentalism is the answer. And intersectional environmentalism offers, I think, a form of activism and engagement to combine all of these issues and tackle them together, specifically for people who still suffer from post-colonial structures and oppressive systems. When communities of color who are impacted the most by environmental injustices and are also leading the way in creating solutions are included in environmental decision-making movements and educational systems, environmentalism will be brighter, more equitable, and more revolutionary for everyone.
Thanks for this practical example, Sheena. And most days, and during interviews like this, I'm full of hope and optimism that we can disrupt inequality and injustice, fight climate change, interconnect the different challenges and solutions we have, and I know this might sound naive, change the world to become a better place. No matter if big or small changes, but sometimes I feel the reality and the world we live in is just so far away from this development and positive progress. And you're an activist yourself. So, is there a learning from your work and activism you would like to share with us before concluding this conversation?
A learning for me was how important it is to find spaces where you can just be, where you can just exist without being questioned. I draw so much strength from my fellow activists and friends. On some days, it's the only thing that actually keeps me going. And another learning is to also allow yourself to take a step back, breathe, rest, and just let it be for a while. I think we can only drive change if we are rested. So that's a very important learning. And maybe a third one is to accept, I think, that it's worth fighting for utopia. I am well aware that everything I just said I will not live to see that come to reality. I am well aware of that. But what would my life look like if I just sat there and be like, okay, then it's not worth fighting for? I think it's worth fighting for. And I think there's so many things that once were utopia for some people and now for us, because people were brave enough to fight for them, for us, they are reality now. So I think that was a learning for me, a big learning within the past years to just accept that it's worth fighting for utopia. Although it's unrealistic and it might sound crazy to some people, but I think it's so important and on a lot of days is what keeps me going.
Thanks so much for sharing this. I think Raquel and I agree 100%. There was again aggressive nodding, but from both sides involved. Yeah. So thank you really for joining us today. I feel like this was an incredibly important episode, connecting and dismantling a few of the topics we've been already coming across during other episodes. And I hope our listeners enjoyed it as much as we did. It was a great pleasure to have you as our guest today and in my last episode. And Raquel will now summarize what we've heard today.
We spoke to Sheena Anderson from the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, an organization with the mission to smash the patriarchy in foreign policy. I do support that mission. Sheena enlightened us about the definition of climate justice, which is basically about caring for people and caring for the planet. She also helped us understand where do feminist foreign policy and climate justice interlink. To make a long story short, women protect the climate and feminist policy protects women. And this logic extends to intersectional policy, which will encompass an even broader section of society and focuses on those who are mostly affected by the climate crisis, least responsible for it, and more in need of support to cope with it. This means that approaches to increase climate justice must not only be gender responsive, but also intersectional in their nature. Sheena highlighted that even though the mainstreaming of climate change as a security issue is a positive thing in terms of awareness of the risks posed by climate change, the militarized responses to climate security are taking the center stage, while people are being left unprepared to deal with it. Also, the UN system does not yet address issues of gender and intersectionality in a comprehensive manner, and the Global North doesn't keep its climate financing promises towards the Global South, often framing financial support as humanitarian aid, as opposed to taking responsibilities for much of the damages to global climate and environment that affects the Global South disproportionately today. In light of all this, we learned that we should look closely and ask, who is not at the decision-making table? Are there any Black, Indigenous, non-binary, elderly, or disabled people, bringing in their perspectives to make sure responses are considering impacts to these groups? If not, we know what we have to do. We must dismantle racist, colonialist, sexist trends also inside the climate bubble.
This is my last episode of the Climate Diplopod. Raquel will be back with another episode in a few weeks. It was always a personal highlight to host this podcast, and I'm grateful to my colleague Raquel and the countless hours that went into this and other projects. It was a real blast, and I will miss you. And of course, to our whole team for the past 2 years, I enjoyed almost every second of it. And you all definitely rock, that's all I can say. And I'm also grateful to all of you for listening in and sharing an interest in the multifaceted field of climate security, and to all our speakers who lead by example. I've learned so much from all of you.
And I just wanted to say thank you so much. It has been great working with you in this podcast. Among other things we've done together, we had so much fun. I will miss you dearly, but you're going to be doing some really cool things, and that's amazing. So I wish you all the best. And as always, you can reach us with questions and feedback on Twitter @ClimateDiplo. Thank you for tuning in. And until next time, goodbye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you, Sheena.
Thank you.
Thank you.